The first sign was not panic, it was silence. Not the dramatic kind that arrives with explosions or collapsing skyscrapers. No alarms screamed through city streets. No emergency broadcasts interrupted television signals. No politicians appeared behind polished podiums warning citizens. About economic catastrophe, the world looked perfectly normal. Outside, traffic lights blinked across rain-soaked intersections. Autonomous delivery vehicles glided silently beneath. Neon advertisements promising convenience, speed, and unlimited access. Financial markets still glowed green on giant digital billboards above the city skyline. Somewhere in the distance, an airplane crossed through low clouds like a moving constellation. Inside the grocery store, everything felt calm, too soft. Piano music floated through hidden speakers. Imported fruit rested beneath artificial lighting, like museum exhibits. Transparent AI assistants hovered beside customers, suggesting recipes based on biometric health data and recent purchases. Wealthy professionals moved through polished aisles with the detached confidence of people living inside. A civilization they believed had finally conquered instability itself. And then the payment systems froze at first. Nobody noticed. A cashier tapped the screen once, then twice. A faint smile crossed her face, the kind employees use when technology briefly malfunctions. Customers continued scrolling through their phones, barely looking up. But the terminals didn't recover. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3, suddenly. Something invisible began spreading through the room. Not chaos, awareness. A man in a perfectly tailored coat attempted to pay for bottled water using his smartwatch. Transaction failed. He tried another card, declined, then another. Nothing. A young woman with a 6-figure crypto portfolio refreshed her banking app repeatedly as the loading icon spun endlessly like a locked door refusing to open. Nearby, an investor managing millions in digital assets stared at a frozen payment screen over a carton of eggs and bread. The wealth was real, yet somehow inaccessible. For 7 minutes, one of the most technologically advanced financial systems on Earth simply stopped responding, and during those 7 minutes, the illusion underneath modern civilization briefly revealed itself, because standing near the back of the line was an elderly woman wearing a faded gray coat. No panic crossed her face. No frustration, no confusion. Quietly, she reached into her pocket and removed several worn paper bills. Cash, wrinkled, physical, almost embarrassingly old-fashioned. The cashier accepted it immediately. No passwords required. No server authorization, no facial recognition, no internet connection. The woman collected her groceries and walked calmly toward the exit, while millionaires remained trapped inside a system they suddenly realized they did not fully control. That moment disappeared from headlines within hours. The networks recovered. Banks issued statements. Financial analysts called it a temporary infrastructure disruption. People laughed nervously and continued shopping. But psychologically, something had shifted, because modern civilization had spent decades convincing itself that cash belonged to the past. Physical currency became associated with inefficiency, criminality, tax evasion, or technological backwardness. Governments encouraged digital payments. Corporations celebrated cashless convenience. Younger generations increasingly moved through life without touching physical money for weeks at a time. And yet, beneath the surface of this frictionless financial utopia, something strange was beginning to happen. Central banks quietly increased emergency liquidity reserves. Major corporations began hoarding record amounts of cash, despite publicly promoting endless economic optimism. Billionaire investors who once mocked dead money suddenly started emphasizing liquidity and defensive positioning. Even ordinary households, exhausted by inflation and uncertainty, began withdrawing more physical currency than economists expected. Why? That is the question almost nobody was asking, because the modern world became hypnotized by abstraction. Money no longer felt physical. It transformed into glowing numbers floating silently across distant servers. Wealth became digital signals, moving at light speed between institutions most people would never see or understand. And abstraction is seductive. It creates the illusion that limitations no longer exist. Infinite digital transactions, infinite leverage, infinite growth. But history carries a warning hidden beneath. Every major civilization that believed it had finally transcended economic gravity. Reality always returns eventually. The Roman Empire once diluted silver coins while insisting the currency remained strong. On the surface, everything appeared stable. Markets continued functioning. Trade survived. Citizens adapted until confidence collapsed faster than authorities could contain it. Centuries later, during the Great Depression, terrified Americans stood outside banks begging to withdraw physical cash before institutions failed entirely. In 2008, perfectly educated professionals stared at ATM machines with the same primal fear ancient civilizations once reserved for failed harvests. And during the banking tremors of the XO 2020s, another uncomfortable truth emerged. Modern finance works only as long as people continue believing it works. Confidence is the real foundation. Not skyscrapers, not algorithms, not markets. Confidence. Confidence. And confidence behaves strangely under pressure. It disappears slowly at first, then all at once. That is what makes 2026 feel different. Because for the first time in history, fear itself can move faster than institutions. A rumor spreads globally before authorities finish writing responses. A banking concern in one country instantly infects markets somewhere else. Panic became digital, automated, algorithmic. The system evolved technologically. Human psychology did not. Deep beneath modern intelligence, people remain biological creatures wired for tangible survival. When uncertainty rises, humans instinctively return to what feels real. What can be held, counted, hidden, controlled personally. That instinct is ancient, and societies everywhere are beginning to feel it. Again, quietly, like pressure building beneath the ocean before a tsunami reaches shore. Because cash is not merely currency. Cash is independence from infrastructure. Cash is optionality during uncertainty. Cash is time. It allows hesitation in economies, dependent on constant movement. It allows people to step outside systems demanding perpetual search participation. And perhaps that is why its return matters far more than most analysts realize. Because civilizations often reveal their deepest fears through the things they declare obsolete. The more aggressively systems push toward total digital dependence, the more psychologically valuable physical certainty becomes. That is the paradox emerging beneath the surface of 2026. The world became more connected than ever before, and simultaneously more fragile. People possess more digital wealth than any generation in human history. Yet, increasingly, they fear losing access to it. And perhaps the real danger is not technological failure itself, but the growing realization that modern civilization may have confused access with ownership. Because throughout history, whenever societies begin worshiping abstraction, reality eventually returns to collect its debt. Human civilization has always measured power through money, but money itself has never truly been about coins, paper, or numbers on a screen. It has always been about belief, long before digital markets, stock exchanges, or central banks existed. Wealth was tangible. A farmer measured survival through grain storage. Kingdoms measured stability through livestock, silver, salt, and fertile land. In ancient societies, value carried physical weight because life itself carried physical risk. Nothing about survival was abstract. A drought could destroy wealth overnight. A failed harvest could collapse entire cities. Gold mattered because it was difficult to obtain. Silver mattered because it required labor, time, and scarcity. Reality disciplined economies because nature disciplined reality, and then humanity discovered something dangerous: the ability to transform trust into currency. At first, the transition seemed harmless. Ancient merchants realized carrying large quantities of metal was inefficient and dangerous. Paper receipts representing stored gold became more convenient than transporting heavy coins across vast distances. But convenience quietly changed civilization forever. Because once societies accepted symbolic money, wealth no longer needed to exist physically in equal proportion to economic activity. Value became psychological. A note represented gold. A signature represented value. A promise represented wealth. And every major economic expansion afterward emerged from this growing distance between reality and representation. The Roman Empire learned this lesson slowly. Then, all at once, as military costs exploded and imperial expansion became increasingly expensive, Roman leaders faced a problem every powerful system eventually encounters: maintaining prosperity without sufficient real resources, so they altered. The currency itself, silver coins, were gradually diluted with cheaper metals while officials publicly insisted the economy remained strong. At first, citizens barely noticed. Trade continued. Markets functioned. Rome still appeared magnificent from the outside, but beneath the surface, something poisonous had begun spreading. Trust weakened invisibly. Prices rose. Citizens hoarded real. Silver merchants demanded more coins for the same goods, and eventually, Rome discovered a terrifying truth repeated throughout history. When money becomes detached from reality, reality eventually retaliates. Centuries later, Europe experienced another financial transformation that reshaped civilization completely. Banking for the first time. Institutions realized wealth could be multiplied through lending rather than merely accumulated through physical reserves. Money no longer sat still inside vaults. It moved, expanded, reproduced through debt. This unlocked extraordinary growth. Trade accelerated across continents. Empires expanded. Industries emerged. Entire nations industrialized faster than any civilization before them. But another paradox quietly emerged beneath the prosperity. The more economies relied on credit, the more fragile confidence became, because debt-based systems do not survive on money alone. They survive on future optimism. People borrow because they believe tomorrow will be larger than today. Governments spend because they assume future growth will absorb present instability. Banks lend because they trust confidence self will continue expanding. That assumption worked remarkably well for decades, until the 20th century exposed how psychologically unstable modern financial systems truly were. The Great Depression shattered the illusion of permanent economic security. Suddenly, millions of citizens discovered that money inside banks was not the same as money inside their hands. Fear spread rapidly. People rushed toward banks demanding physical cash before institutions collapsed completely. Families hid savings inside walls, beneath mattresses, inside kitchen containers. Nowhere tangible felt safer than promises. The psychology was ancient. When trust weakens, humans instinctively returned to possession. Then came Bretton Woods after World War II. The global economy rebuilt itself around the US dollar, backed by gold. Stability returned because money still appeared connected to something physical beneath the surface. But in 1971, the connection broke quietly, almost casually. The United States abandoned the gold standard entirely, removing the final tether between modern currency and tangible reserves. And from that moment forward, The world entered a completely new financial reality. Money became pure confidence. The implications were enormous. Without gold limiting currency creation, governments and central banks gained unprecedented flexibility. Debt expanded dramatically. Credit culture accelerated. Consumption became the engine of economic identity itself. By the 1980s, wealth increasingly came not from producing tangible goods, but from financial expansion, asset appreciation, and leveraged speculation. The world became richer. But also, stranger. Credit cards normalized future spending. Mortgages expanded housing bubbles. Corporations borrowed aggressively. Financial engineering began outperforming physical production. Then technology accelerated everything. Computers transformed markets into hyper-reactive ecosystems, where trillions of dollars moved through algorithms operating faster than human. Comprehension. Wealth became digital abstraction layered upon digital abstraction, and the higher the financial skyscraper rose, the less connected it became to the ground beneath it. After the 2008 financial crisis, central banks flooded economies with liquidity on a scale previously unimaginable. Quantitative easing became normalized. Interest rates collapsed toward zero. Cheap money spread everywhere like oxygen pumped into a struggling patient. For a while, it appeared miraculous. Stock markets surged, real estate exploded. Tech billionaires multiplied. Luxury consumption intensified. But beneath the prosperity, another paradox formed quietly in the shadows. Cheap money did not eliminate instability. It delayed consequences, and delayed consequences tend to return larger than before. The pandemic years accelerated this transformation beyond anything modern history had experienced. Governments printed staggering amounts of money to stabilize collapsing economies. Stimulus flooded financial systems while supply chains fractured globally. Suddenly, markets behaved almost independently from reality itself. Stock valuations climbed during economic shutdowns. Asset prices soared while ordinary households struggled with rising living costs. The global economy began resembling a massive hall of mirrors where perception mattered more than substance. And perhaps that was the most dangerous shift of all. Modern economies no longer operated primarily on productivity. They operated on narrative. Markets responded faster to headlines than fundamentals. Investors chased momentum rather than value. Entire industries became dependent on maintaining psychological optimism regardless of underlying structural weakness. The financial system appeared enormous from the outside, but inside, confidence carried increasing pressure. History contains a warning most civilizations ignore during periods of abundance. Every monetary system eventually reaches a point where belief weakens faster than institutions can restore it. Ancient empires faced this problem. Slowly across generations, modern civilization may experience it at digital speed, because for the first time in human history, panic itself became technologically amplified. Fear, no longer spreads city by city. It spreads instantly. algorithmic globally. And if modern, money is ultimately built upon confidence. What happens when confidence itself becomes volatile? Most people imagine the financial system incorrectly. They picture giant vaults buried beneath banks, towers of cash protected by steel doors and armed guards, a stable machine storing societies, wealth safely in the background while everyday life moves forward above it. But modern finance does not function like a vault. It functions like oxygen, invisible, constantly moving, dependent on uninterrupted circulation, and the moment circulation slows, the entire organism begins struggling to breathe. That is the hidden architecture underneath modern civilization. At the center of this system sits one of the strangest inventions in human history. Fractional reserve banking. The concept sounds technical, almost boring, but its implications are enormous. When people deposit money into banks, most assume their funds simply remain there waiting safely for withdrawal. In reality, much of that money immediately begins moving elsewhere. Banks lend it, invest it, leverage it, and transform it into layers of expanding economic activity. A single deposited dollar can support multiple dollars of loans throughout the system. Mortgages, corporate debt, government bonds, consumer credit, entire economies built upon confidence multiplying itself, and during stable periods, the system appears almost magical. Growth accelerates, businesses expand, housing markets rise, consumption flourishes. Wealth seems to reproduce endlessly, but hidden inside this miracle is a terrifying weakness. The system works only if most people never demand physical access to their money at the same time, because there is not enough immediately available liquidity to satisfy everyone simultaneously. That realization alone changes how modern finance must be understood. Banks do not fear cash withdrawals because cash is outdated. Banks fear cash withdrawals because cash exposes the mathematical boundaries hidden beneath digital abundance. Physical money interrupts illusion, and modern economies survive largely through illusion management. That is why governments and corporations increasingly encourage digital behavior at every level of society. Frictionless transactions accelerate economic velocity. Invisible spending keeps consumers participating continuously without emotionally processing each financial decision. Tap-to-pay systems. Auto-renewing. Subscriptions, buy-now-pay-later financing. Instant loans approved by algorithms within seconds. The goal is not merely convenience, it is acceleration, because debt-driven systems require constant movement, the way sharks require constant motion through water. If spending slows significantly, the machine begins suffocating. This is why interest rates became so psychologically explosive during the mid-2020s. For nearly 15 years after the 2008 financial crisis, cheap money flooded the global economy like anesthesia. Borrowing felt painless. Corporations refinanced endlessly. Governments accumulated staggering debt levels, while markets continued climbing upward. Entire industries became dependent on ultra-low interest rates. Tech startups survived without profits because borrowing remained cheap. Real estate expanded aggressively because mortgages remained affordable. Investors chased increasingly risky assets because safe returns disappeared almost entirely. The world adjusted to artificial financial gravity. Then the gravity changed. Interest rates began rising again, and suddenly, the hidden fragility underneath the system became visible. Zombie companies that survived only through cheap borrowing began collapsing under refinancing pressure. Commercial real estate markets weakened as remote work emptied office towers across major cities. Governments faced enormous debt servicing costs that quietly consumed larger portions of national budgets. Consumers felt the shift most brutally. Inflation eroded purchasing power faster than wages could adapt. Pandemic savings disappeared. Households increasingly relied on financing systems just to maintain ordinary lifestyles. In previous generations, debt financed expansion. Now, debt increasingly financed survival. That psychological transition matters enormously because modern economies are emotional ecosystems disguised as mathematical systems. Consumers spend confidently when they believe tomorrow will improve. Businesses invest aggressively when the future appears stable. Banks lend freely when optimism dominates perception. But once populations begin losing confidence in the future itself, behavior changes rapidly. People delay purchases, avoid risk, save more aggressively, hold liquidity. In other words, they begin slowing down financially. Ironically, Rational caution becomes dangerous inside debt-based economies. Because the system depends on perpetual participation, it requires velocity, and this is where cash becomes psychologically disruptive. Cash slows. Velocity cash allows waiting. Cash creates distance between individuals and the constant movement demanded by modern finance. Holding physical currency becomes a subtle act of resistance against systems dependent on endless circulation. That is why governments fear deflation far more than most people realize. Inflation, while painful, keeps money moving. Prices rise, people spend quickly. Businesses continue operating. Deflation creates hesitation. Consumers delay purchases because tomorrow may offer lower prices. Economic activity contracts. Debt burdens become heavier relative to slowing growth. The machine begins choking on its own weight. This explains why central banks intervene so aggressively during financial crises. They are not merely protecting markets, they are protecting motion itself. Because once societies psychologically shift from spending to preserving, modern economies entered dangerous territory. And during the banking scares of the 2020s, millions of people suddenly rediscovered something unsettling. Digital wealth is conditional. Access to money depends entirely on systems functioning properly. Electricity, internet, infrastructure, server networks, banking permissions, institutional stability, public confidence. Remove any layer, and access disappears instantly. That realization changed people psychologically, even if they struggled to articulate it directly. Modern civilization trained populations to believe convenience equals security. But convenience and security are not the same thing. In fact, history suggests they often move in opposite directions. The more frictionless systems become, more vulnerable they become to disruption. And beneath the polished language of innovation and financial modernization, another uncomfortable truth emerged. Modern people increasingly do not own money in the traditional sense. They possess access granted temporarily through interconnected systems they neither control nor fully understand. That distinction becomes terrifying during instability, because access can freeze, permissions can change, infrastructure can fail, confidence can evaporate, and central banks now face an impossible trap with no painless escape. If they print excessive money to stimulate economies, inflation weakens confidence in currency itself. If they raise rates aggressively to control inflation, economic activity contracts and debt structures begin fracturing. If they continue supporting markets endlessly, debt expands beyond sustainable levels. If they stop supporting markets, asset bubbles begin collapsing violently. Every path creates instability. Somewhere else, the system became trapped between inflation and suffocation, between preserving confidence and exposing fragility, and somewhere inside that contradiction, old quietly regained importance, not glamorous, not technologically advanced, not efficient, but psychologically powerful cash. Because during periods of uncertainty, people do not merely seek returns, they seek certainty. And certainty is becoming increasingly rare inside modern finance. The return of cash psychology is not happening in one country. It is happening everywhere. In Argentina, generations survived inflation by converting paychecks into physical dollars almost immediately, treating cash not as currency but as protection against institutional memory. In China, the rise of digital payment ecosystems and central bank digital currency experiments revealed a future where transactions could become fully visible to centralized systems. Across Europe, energy shocks exposed how fragile modern prosperity becomes when supply chains fracture unexpectedly. Meanwhile, America continued expanding debt at historic levels, while Japan maintained one of the largest monetary experiments in human history. keeping interest rates unnaturally low for years to preserve economic stability. At first glance, these crises appear disconnected, but they are deeply linked. That is the paradox of globalization. The world looks politically divided while financially behaving like a single nervous system. A banking issue in one region can destabilize pension funds somewhere else. Interest rate hikes in Washington can weaken currencies across emerging markets within weeks. A supply chain disruption in Asia can increase living costs for families thousands of miles away. The global economy became a hyper-optimized machine, built for efficiency rather than resilience, and efficient systems often break violently under pressure because they lack shock absorbers. Across continents, populations increasingly share the same psychological symptoms: rising distrust in institutions, fear of losing purchasing power, anxiety about savings, asset bubbles few people truly understand, a growing sense that technological progress is accelerating while personal stability declines. At the geopolitical level, governments publicly promote stability while quietly preparing for fragmentation. Nations discuss de-dollarization. Central banks increase gold reserves. Digital currency infrastructure expands rapidly beneath public attention because beneath the surface, countries understand something uncomfortable. Financial systems are becoming geopolitical weapons as much as economic tools, and inside that realization, cash gains a strange new meaning. It is no longer merely currency, it becomes autonomy, a temporary shield against a world increasingly mediated by algorithms, surveillance systems, sanctions, cyber risks, and centralized financial permissions. That is the deeper shift unfolding globally in 2026. Not a rejection of technology, but a growing awareness that hyperconnected systems create hyperconnected vulnerabilities. And perhaps beneath the headlines, governments already understand something the public is only beginning to sense. The next era of global finance may be far less stable than the last.